All right, folks, I'm going to get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to yet another section of Econ 161, Macroeconomics. So this is the last time we'll meet before the first exam, so keep that in mind. Hopefully it's been in mind and you are prepared for the exam up until this point, and then, of course, you'll have a week, roughly, to cover the stuff we covered today, and then you'll be fully prepared to get a solid A on the exam, and I will be very happy, and you will be very happy, and it'll just be a room full of happy people, I'm sure. I hope. Just make it happen, is what I'm saying. Make it happen. Crazy stuff. I just got that email about the attempted kidnapping or something. Like, it's crazy. Like, just be careful, essentially, is what this whole situation should tell you. Like, be careful out there. It's just weird. Like, I grew up in the Valley, and like I just don't ever remember it being this like kind of crime-ridden. But maybe it has always been like on campuses. I don't know. When I went to SC, that's like in the middle of downtown. It was like basically military state type of situation where you have like just police like protecting the campus. But I never expected that to be the case here. When I went up to Santa Cruz, every now and then you'd get like some weird email about some like violent crime, including like murder, like just like a mile away or like less than a mile away from campus. And it was just like weird. I just thought, oh wow, I'm like a fish out of water here. I'm not used to this kind of thing. And now I'm coming here and like I'm hearing all this stuff about things that are happening around campus. Is this something that's been going on the last couple of years? Like, is it pretty standard for people to get assaulted on the street and like people to get assaulted in the parking lots and stuff? It's a weekly thing? Yeah. I mean, it might have something to do with like, just since 2008, like the economic downturn and just people becoming more desperate and like, and then, the more desperate people are when the economy is depressed, like the worse things they're willing to do to survive. I don't know. Anyway, be careful, folks, especially if you're like a small person that people would want to touch and do things to. Like, be especially careful. Maybe get some like, self-defense training type of stuff. Anyway. All right, so again, like the first exam is going to be a week from today. So I'll send an email today just to remind you of what you'll need, but you will need a green Scantron. I think it's 882 something. I don't know. I'll email exactly which one you need. You will need a calculator as well. You cannot have a graphing calculator though, so don't bring a graphing calculator because graphing calculators can save information. Yeah, that is the one. And also phones. No phones will be allowed at all because, like I've said before, phones are not phones. They are very powerful computers that just happen to be able to make phone calls. So don't. If you have a phone out, it will be grounds for failure. So don't have a phone out. So yeah, you'll need a calculator. You'll need a pencil, obviously, to fill in the multiple choice stuff on the Scantron. But there will be open answer questions. If you've looked at the practice exam, you understand that will be the format that you're facing, and so that is what you should be looking forward to. So again, we've covered chapters 1 through 3, and we covered 6 through 7, and part of 8. Today we'll finish 8 and 9, and that'll be the 7 chapters that are covered on this exam. Now, just keep in mind, though, chapter 1 is very simple basic principles that we covered. Not too much there. Chapter 2, some models that we were introduced to that you have to know how they work and be able to kind of work those models. So just be sure you're familiar with those and are able to do everything that I did. And of course, the language that's introduced in that chapter, make sure you understand it and are able to wield it. And then we did the supply and demand chapter, and that chapter also has a very specific model that's very important to economics, obviously. And you should understand the mechanics understand what happens when things change in that model, what's the result, what does it mean. So be able to understand that. And then, of course, beyond that, we started to introduce like the macroeconomy and like the various concepts that we'll be covering in the course. That was in chapter 6. So a lot of sort of groundwork like vocabulary. That's basically the big takeaway from that chapter. And then on chapter 7 and chapter 8, we started talking about like GDP and then and now unemployment and inflation. So Again, everything that I've done, I'm going to expect you to be able to do. Obviously, you're not going to have to do everything, but you should be able to do everything. And also the language. And then, like, I won't ask for specific, like, dates or, times. Like, what happened in India during this time period? I'm not going to ask something like that. But, like today, chapter 9, we're going to cover economic growth and the factors that affect that. So I'll mention the main ones. So those are the kind of things you need to understand. And that's also part of like kind of learning the vocabulary and ultimately the subject of what we're doing. Because obviously growth is a big topic in macroeconomics. We want to figure out, well, how do economies grow over time? And so we'll be looking at like models that kind of explain short run and long run effects of growth. And so you need to understand the nature of growth, like all the various topics that we cover today. So make sure you understand all of that. Before I get started with the material, are there any questions not having to do with the material about anything in general? Yes.
So do you suggest on the best way to prepare for the test is taking your practice one or
Well, certainly after, yeah, after today, like once we cover all the material, yeah, take that practice exam, see where you stand, and then yeah, just kind of go from there. But like I said, like go through the lectures, go through the vocabulary, go through the models that are represented sometimes graphically. There were only a couple we covered so far, but like the other stuff, like the tools that we use, like to compute like certain things, like inflation or GDP, like you have to be able to do those things, understand why we did them in the way that we did them, that sort of thing. So. No, you'll need a green Scantron, and I'll email the exact form number today. You'll need that, and then there'll also be a form that I provide you, and so that's where you'll answer the open-ended questions, and that will have all the questions on it as well, the multiple choice ones. There might be graphing, yeah, it's possible. So just keep that in mind. Like, yes. Quizzes. Oh, you mean the homework? So just remember, I made videos, so you can just go back to the videos, and it's all there. If the system doesn't allow you, it should allow you to. But if it doesn't allow you to, you can just check the videos out to review. Other questions? All right. So yeah.
I haven't fully navigated through Launchpad yet. Does it have like practice quizzes?
There's a bunch of tools in there. Like I think they have like a flashcard tool, and like if you explore it, there's like different things you could do. That can help you. Yeah. Anything else? All right, folks. Like this is an important time in the semester, obviously, but like just in general, as I've said, like you are choosing to be here. Nobody's forcing you to be here. Like you made a choice to come to college. You made a choice to take this class, to pay for this class. Like if you are not going to like try your absolute best to do your absolute best in this class, regardless of what it means to you in the long run, like then you are blowing an opportunity for yourself. And really it is about like setting a precedent for yourself of the things that you can accomplish so that when you get out of here and you've accomplished quite a bit and you've sort of cultivated this person inside of you that is able to take anything on and just take it down, meaning like do as well as possible in it, then that will carry through into life and it will take you to the kind of successes you want out of life. But if you just kind of are here and like just kind of want to like make it, like, yeah, that will allow you to make it through this college and you will wind up with a degree. Whether or not that degree will actually do something for you though beyond these walls is questionable, because in the end, like you will be amongst a pool of everybody in the world that's around your age, or maybe in some reasonable radius, that are looking for the same things you're looking for. And if there isn't something inside of you that people want to be around, that people want to have around, people want to say, yes, you and you and you deserve these opportunities that everybody wants so much, then you just won't get them. And then you're just going to wind up in situations where, yeah, there will be opportunities for you, but they might not be the best ones. And you may not be that happy with the entire result of everything that you've done here. So if you start putting in a lot of work now and like just really set that precedent for yourself of like, I'm going to take things on. I don't care what it means. I don't care how trivial it might seem. Like, I'm going to take it on and I'm going to conquer it. Like, if you have that mentality and you carry it with you and it becomes like you, then you will have a lot to look forward to. So that's what these moments are about. That's what exam times are about. It's about like testing yourself. It's not about the grade in the class or like, what maybe people around you might think. It's not about any of that. It's about you proving things to yourself and then laying that foundation of like a really strong person that can thrive. So just keep that in mind always, and do your absolute best. So this next week again is an opportunity. Just don't blow it. Take the opportunity, and just next week, like, just conquer this exam, please. All right. So again, yes. Yeah, of course there will be a curve. Of course there will be a curve. Yes, there will be a curve. Yes, but again, curves are misleading. Okay, like maybe here it'll feel like, okay, I did something and I got through, and maybe even the curve gets you to a point where you like feel very accomplished. But you can't compare yourself to what's happening here. You have to think about what's going on out there. Out there's not in here. Okay, out there you're compared with everyone. And you have as much value as anybody in this world. People going to Harvard, people going to UCLA, people going to Berkeley. You do have as much value as them, but you need to cultivate that in order to show people that once you're out there. Now, here. Okay. All right, folks. So we started on chapter 8 last week. It deals with unemployment and inflation. So today we'll continue with that. We'll introduce what's called the natural rate of unemployment, the sort of like the kind of unemployment that you would expect in a world where you have a bunch of people like that are working or not working and like trying to find new jobs, or maybe in different industries within that bigger economy, things aren't going too well, or things are sort of weird, and so that's causing just like a natural amount of unemployment that's independent of maybe like big fluctuations in the economy, big ups and downs in the economy. So that's what the natural rate is. We'll talk more about it obviously when we get to it. And the various types of unemployment that we can define in relation to the bigger concept. And then we'll talk about inflation and deflation. So we talked about last week how to measure inflation. I'll do a quick review of that. And then today we'll talk about sort of the big issues associated with inflation, and then also deflation, which is the opposite case where prices are coming down rather than going up. And then we'll get into chapter 9, which deals with long-run economic growth. So like the increasing capacity of an economy to produce. So, in the world, there is a big distribution of like winners and losers, essentially, like people that countries that are doing exceptionally well and countries that aren't doing exceptionally well, right? You've got the developing countries, and they're sort of like struggling to like get to where we're at, the developed world. And so we'll talk about the issues that sort of allow maybe like us to become what we've become, as along with like our other Western partners, and then we'll talk about like what may be happening with some of these other countries, and like maybe what can happen for them to kind of get to the level that we're at over time, over the long run. So those are the big issues we'll talk about. So we'll talk about comparing economies across time and space, the sources of long-run economic growth, and why growth rates differ, and success, disappointments, and failure. Just talk about the various cases. And finally, of course, is world growth sustainable? Can we continue to grow? Gesundheit. All right. So previously, in chapter 7, we talked about measuring GDP. We talked about aggregate output being like one way of measuring GDP, the value of final goods and services produced in the economy's total value of output of final goods and services, final goods being the goods that are sold to the end user like us, whereas intermediate goods are the goods sold between companies as components to the final goods. And that was one way of measuring GDP, gross domestic product, but we talked about issues with nominal GDP versus real GDP, whereas with nominal GDP, if you are basing your valuation of everything that's being produced on current prices, and prices are going up over time, then that will give you the wrong idea about how your economy may be growing, because if it's just prices that are growing, then that's not really saying anything about like your increased capacity to produce. And so we talked about real GDP versus nominal GDP. Real GDP being the total value of all final goods and services produced in the economy during a given year, calculated using the prices of a selected base year. So you pick a year, and like the prices from that year are what you price everything at from that year forward. And so we did an example here where we had apples and oranges, and we looked at how we can measure like the increase in real GDP by taking the first year's output and getting some number for that. And then the second year's output will depend on the prices of the first year. And then that got us to an output that then can be measured, can be compared to the first year in terms of just like the growth of the output versus any effect on prices. So we controlled for the effect on prices by doing this. And then to get the percent increase, we took the difference of the two as a fraction of the original amount, 1,300. In this case, it was 0.154, and multiply that by 100 to get to a percentage. So it was 15.4% in that case. And now there is an issue though of like, well, what year do you choose? And like, if you use a base year and you get some like real GDP percentage increase, but then you use like maybe a second, like if you're comparing 2 years, if you use the second year's prices instead of the first year's prices in both years to compare the growth in GDP, then you're going to get different numbers. And so how we adjust for that, how our government adjusts for that, is by doing what's called chaining the dollars. So you have chained dollars, the methods of calculating changes in real GDP using the average between the growth rate calculated using an early base year and the growth rate calculated using a later base year. So they take basically the average of the two growth rates using different base years, either at the tail end or at the front end of whatever range you're looking at. All right, then we talked about this measure GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is the amount of GDP divided by the size of the population. It's equivalent to the average GDP per person. And that gives us a better idea of like how maybe like living standards can be compared amongst different countries versus just like looking at GDP, which is just like how much can a country produce? Like we don't really know what that means in relation to like the population. And so if you take the GDP per capita, it's a better sort of measure of that allows us to then compare like, the states of different people across different places. All right, also in chapter 7, quickly we talked about price indexes and how we measure like the change in prices. So the aggregate price level is what we're always interested in order to measure inflation, the changing rate of prices over time. In inflation, it's the increase in prices over time. So the aggregate price level is a measure of the overall level of prices in the economy. So what we do is we select a market basket, which is a hypothetical set of consumer purchases of goods and services. And we maybe value all of them at a particular time. So we look at, in this case, we had oranges, grapefruit, and lemons. And we looked at the quantities times the prices, and that got us to $95. And then something changed. There was a frost in this case, which caused the prices of these goods to go up. And so that led us to value the output at 175. And so then what we did is we took the change as a fraction of the base amount of value. So you want to figure out, well, how much have prices changed? So we compare prices now to prices at some base year. And then that gives us a number, which is then an index, which allows us to say, well, in this case, prices are 1.842 times greater after this change. And if you multiply that by 100, you can get to 84.2%, this decimal residual, which is the increase of the proportional increase of the prices. And then that allows you to measure how much prices have increased. And then that allows us to establish a price index, which measures the cost of purchasing a given market basket in a given year, where the cost is normalized so that it's equal to 100 in the selected base year. So, if we're looking at the initial year, in this case, it was like those fruits before this frost that changed the prices. The amount the prices are as a fraction of itself times 100 gets us to 100, and that's the process that we employ in order to normalize an index to a base year. So we say, well, that base year is equal to 100, and this is how we get that 100 number. We just multiply the value by itself, and then multiply it by 100, and that gets us to the 100 base number to be able to compare other numbers to. So that's what an index does. Like, you index it to something. So an index is always sort of meant to compare some different situation to some like baseline example. So in this case, it would be some base year that we choose. Alrighty, and then to measure the inflation rate, which is the percent change per year in a price index, typically what's called the consumer price index is what we usually use in the US, is that we take the difference between the price index in maybe 2 years as a fraction of like the first year, multiply that by 100, so and then that's going to get us to the inflation rate, which was that residual amount of like 1.842. That 0.842 was the rate of inflation between year 1 and year 2 because of the frost. So that was multiplying that by 100 gets us to 84.2%, which is the inflation rate. I'm just reviewing stuff that we covered last week because obviously we don't meet that often, so I want there to be some connectivity between what we've done and what we're doing. Anyway, consumer price index is the index used in the U.S. It's calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It measures the cost of the market basket of a typical urban American family. We also have other indexes we use. We have the producer price index, which measures changes in the prices of goods purchased by producers. So just even though we might have standard like metrics, measures that tell us things about what's happening in the economy that are sort of the dominant ones, you always want to obviously rely on different data to kind of get a broader idea of what's going on. Another one we use is called the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator for a given year is 100 times the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP in that year. So if we're talking about the base year that we use to calculate real GDP, then that's just going to be equal to 1 because it'll be nominal GDP over real GDP, which will actually also be equal to nominal GDP that year. But at any other time, like GDP, the real GDP will differ from nominal GDP, and again, because we're measuring it based on prices of a base year, like I went over already. All right, anyway, then we moved on to Chapter 8, employment and inflation. We talked about unemployment a bit. Employment, again, and again, these definitions are specific to economics, so you need to, even though you understand the concept of being employed or being unemployed, and in layman's terms, like you need to just kind of allow in the vocabulary of this class, at least while you're in this class, but even just to kind of use it as a tool going forward when you talk about like, well, what is the government talking about when they're talking about unemployed folks? Well, they're talking about these definitions. This is what they're talking about. So employment is the number of people currently employed in the economy, either full-time or part-time. So we do consider part-time folks to be part of the employed pool. Unemployment is a number of people who are actively looking for work but aren't currently employed. And that...
True, technically, now, though, I mean, as far as the way they shape it now, statistically, people who are removed completely from the employment market, who are not looking for work because they can't find it, haven't been able to for a year, 2 years, 3 years.
Right.
Are considered actually, I digress, they're actually considered employed.
So look, like we talked about this last week, where like you have like other measures that kind of include those people. Some of those people are called discouraged workers, and then you have a sort of a longer stage of that, which is like then they fall into a category of marginally attached workers. And so there are different measures of unemployment that are used to sort of gauge unemployed. But as far as like your standard measure, like that number you always hear about in the news, like that is basically just measuring the amount of people that are not employed but are looking for work, that are currently looking for work. And that is a fraction, as a fraction of the labor force. So a labor force is the sum of employed and unemployed folks. the labor force participation rate. So who's in the labor force? Because obviously there's more people in the world besides the people that are either employed or unemployed. So the labor force participation rate is the percentage of the labor force of the population age 16 or older. So obviously in this country, below the age of 16, it's illegal to work. So, for those 60 and older, they could work. And so then a proportion of those are actually either working or looking for work, and that is what we consider to be the labor force. So the unemployment rate was the number of unemployed workers as a fraction of the labor force. Multiply that by 100 to get the unemployment rate. Now, again, unemployment rate can overstate the true level of unemployed because you might have people that actually maybe already have a job or can easily find a job, but they're between jobs, and so that's sort of a way that the measure can overstate the true level of unemployment, and it can also understate the true level of unemployment because there's people who would like to find work, but again aren't working because they just gave up looking for work, as the gentleman here just mentioned. And so these are called discouraged workers, non-working people who are capable of working but have given up looking for a job given the state of the job market. And then you have marginally attached workers. So discouraged workers are part of this larger group called marginally attached workers. Workers that would like to be employed and have looked for a job in the recent past but are not currently looking for work. And then you also have folks that are called underemployed, people that are maybe working part-time and would like to be working full-time, but they can't find full-time work. And so in some ways that is unemployed as well, but we do consider those people to be employed. But again, there are other measures that, again, are put together by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that calculate the various unemployment rates. And what we saw last week was that the measures tend to move together pretty closely. I left out the slide here today, and so what's ultimately important about all of these measures is like what's happening in terms of like the growth, the change of all these measures, because they all did move in the same direction. And so they all kind of, if they're all moving in the same direction, that is what we're looking for from this number. We're looking for like what's happening like in the unemployed pool, like in these various groups. Like, is that group growing? Is that group contracting? And that's really the signals that we're looking for to figure out, what may be happening in the economy. And we also talked about how like the relationship between unemployment and growth. So generally, so this is like these bars here represented like recession type periods, and you can always see that the unemployment rate tends to increase during recession type periods. Obviously, recessions are periods in which the economy is contracting. That means it's not producing as much. That means there aren't as many people working. So obviously, you're going to have this like relationship between recessions and unemployment that's going to correlate highly. But as we see, there are the periods immediately after recessions, you will still get like growth of unemployment, and that's what's called a jobless recovery, a period in which a real GDP growth rate is positive, but the unemployment rate is still rising. So remember, with recessions, we define recessions as like 2 successive periods of contraction. And so, like that sort of very specific definition can sometimes not necessarily reflect exactly what's happening in the economy. And so this is obviously things that people that do the analysis at these various government bureaus are aware of. And so, they take these things into account. And the world's more complicated than the simple relationships that we would like to assume. But there are some relationships that are valid. So again, like there is like this negative relationship between the change in the unemployment rate and the real GDP growth rate. So if you got high real GDP growth rates, you're going to have low unemployment and vice versa. So there is kind of like a negative relationship. So this is part of what we do in economics, which is like we'll look at a bunch of data points and then we'll try to like establish some like clear-cut relationship between the variables we're studying. So you can kind of place like a line in the middle of all this that could represent the relationship between these variables. And how we actually fit that line is through statistical analysis. So economics has incorporated statistics into its discipline. So there's like a sub-discipline of economics called econometrics that deals specifically with statistical techniques meant to analyze economic situations. If you're interested at all, it is a good course to take. You have to take statistics first and then take that course, but it's really useful, like just to kind of understand the methods. It gets a lot more complicated than the introductory course that you would have here, but it's definitely worth your time to kind of understand the methods because you may use it, or you may just encounter numbers or relationships that are graphed or whatnot that you want to kind of understand, like where did this come from, and this will explain it to you. All right, so let's get on with today's lecture. All right, so the natural rate of unemployment says, so it's likely that there's going to be always some folks that are unemployed in the economy, and that's going to have really nothing to do with what's happening in the overall economy. It's going to have everything to do with what's happening in maybe sectors of the economy, like particular industries. Also, like the amount of people that are maybe just like between jobs, and like for whatever reason, you're always going to have people between jobs. So over the past half century, the national unemployment rate has never dropped below 2.9%. So you can kind of think, well, that might be the natural rate of unemployment, but not necessarily. That could just be like the lower bound of like how far the unemployment rate went beyond like the natural rate. And we'll explain why it would deviate from it in a second. So again, there's different reasons why this could be happening. So let's talk about job creation and job destruction as maybe a source of natural unemployment. So even during good times, folks lose jobs and have trouble finding work, right? Like even during the boom of the dot-com boom that occurred like post like the mid-90s, you know, like we had like this huge proliferation growth of like these amazing new industries, and like there was all this money everywhere, and people could, you know, make it, like go work at these great big firms, and there was a lot of opportunity. But obviously along with that came the destruction of old industries. So you have what's called creative destruction. One of the things I mentioned last week was like the actual physical film industry. Like Kodak, a huge company, is now nearly out of business. Just any company that, or any industry that was like basically made obsolete by new technologies through this process of what's called creative destruction. Even though we had like sort of a boom period in the overall economy, we had like what's called structural unemployment within those industries. So again, one reason for this is like structural changes in the economy. Industries rise and fall. This is a normal thing. So another reason is poor management of firms, or bad luck at individual companies. So in the early 2000s, we had like the whole Enron thing, where you had this huge company, enormous, so many people working for it, so much money within it, and then it was revealed that like their accounting practices were totally corrupt, and like the value of the company that they would ostensibly tell the public they had was just false. It was just straight false. Because there were rules at the agencies that governed like this kind of company that allowed them to basically just tell people what their value was rather than having to prove it. And so then that company was just like wiped out of existence, and all these people were out of business. And then that whole sector that was related to what these folks were doing, these financial services, was affected by that. You know, like obviously people started to pull back because maybe it wasn't just Enron, you know, maybe it was these other big firms as well. There's actually a really good documentary, Enron something. It's really good. It's like really well done, really kind of entertaining as well. I recommend watching it if you're interested. But anyway, so yeah, like you can have these big movements in the economy that have nothing to do with the overall ups and downs of the economy. And then another type of unemployment you can have is called frictional unemployment. So obviously a job search, just formally defined, means that workers who spend time looking for employment engage in this search. Everyone knows what a job search is. So if all jobs and all work were identical, obviously there would be no search because it would be easy to just jump onto the next job that perfectly fits you. But because that is not the case, we have what's called frictional unemployment. Unemployment due to the time workers spend in job search. So one of the reasons for unemployment of this type is scarcity of information. So it's sort of difficult to like identify the right fit for yourself, and also for firms to identify the right fits for them. So matching people to jobs takes time. You know, like you never know who could fit the right position. A limited amount of frictional unemployment, though, may be a good thing, given that people should take their time to find the right fit, because then they won't be unemployed again for a while, or maybe ever. And of course, firms then get to save money on having to train new people, etc. So the economy does work better when skills are applied to the right jobs. All right, so in periods of higher unemployment, when the unemployment rate is high in general, workers tend to be jobless for longer periods. So this is the duration of employment in 2007. 36% were unemployed for less than 5 weeks, and then another 31% were unemployed from 5 to 14 weeks. So that's about 67% that were only unemployed for about 14 weeks. That's actually a relatively short amount of time. And then getting into the longer periods, all the way up to 27 weeks, it was a small amount of folks. 2007 was right before the crash. Things were going really well. And so long-term unemployment wasn't that high. So again, in periods of high unemployment, workers tend to be jobless for longer periods. This suggests that a smaller share of unemployment is frictional. So here we see the long-term unemployed, and here's around 2007, 2008, roughly, small percentage of the overall employed. But then things obviously went ridiculously haywire post-2008, post the crash, and all the banking madness and everything that happened during that period that caused us to go into the Great Recession. And we see that long-term unemployment dramatically increased, which tells us that, again, a smaller share of the unemployment is due to frictional unemployment when unemployment is high, when people are unemployed for longer periods of time. So again, that's frictional unemployment, when people are just kind of like trying to find jobs. The other type of unemployment so that's one of the main components of what's called the natural rate of unemployment, and the other component is the structural unemployment, which I already talked about, but I'll talk about a little bit more here. So the existence of frictional unemployment does not mean that there is a surplus of labor. It does not mean that there's like a lot of extra labor to go around. It just means people are looking for jobs. Structural unemployment means that more people are seeking jobs in a particular labor market than there are jobs available at the current wage rate, even when the economy is at the peak of the business cycle. So when the economy is at the peak of the business cycle, that's when things are great, right? That's when the economy, as far as like its short-term fluctuations, is as good as it possibly can be before it heads into like a recession, a contraction. So one of the causes for structural unemployment, again, has to do with like particular industries and maybe like the labor markets within those industries. So this is an example of a labor market using the supply and demand model. So people that are looking for jobs are the suppliers in this case. So if you're looking for a job at any point, you are supplying your labor. You're willing to supply it to firms that are then buying your labor. So they are the consumers in the labor market. So here's the downward sloping demand curve. Here's the upward sloping supply curve. There's our price, which in this case is the wage that's being paid for labor. And here's, of course, our quantity, which in this case represents the quantity of labor in the market. And again, you have labor demand downward sloping because it reflects the law of demand. As the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. So as the wage rate is higher, then firms tend to demand less folks, and vice versa. And then, of course, labor supply moves in the opposite direction, following the law of supply, in which the higher the price is, the higher the quantity supplied is. So you might have a situation where like the equilibrium wage, so this is the equilibrium here, it's where the supply and demand curves meet, establishing an equilibrium wage in the market and an equilibrium quantity of folks that are being employed. So if for, let's say, some reason like the wage in the market is above that equilibrium wage, in that case, you're going to have a situation where you're going to have the quantity demanded being lower at that wage than the quantity supplied. So you're going to have what's called a surplus. In this case, there would be a surplus of labor. So that's one way of sort of understanding structural unemployment, where maybe in an industry the wage is higher than it needs to be. But in general, there wouldn't be any structural unemployment in this labor market at the equilibrium, and the reasons why that might be different. One of them might be like minimum wages. So, like if the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage for a particular market, labor market, then that will cause structural unemployment. But in most markets, the minimum wage is actually below the equilibrium wage. So folks are getting paid more than the minimum wage. So the minimum wage would be down here. But if, let's say, the minimum wage is up here, then that's what's called a price floor, basically stating that the price cannot go below that price. But we know that above an equilibrium, the price is always trying to get to the equilibrium. Because, like, let's say up here you have a bunch of folks willing to supply their labor in this case, and then you have a bunch of folks here that are willing to buy it, but obviously not enough. There's a surplus, and there's therefore going to be a lot of folks that are unemployed. And because of that, then these folks are going to start to lower the amount they're willing to take, right? If there isn't a minimum wage, and so then they'll start lowering their price. That means you have a bunch of buyers here for labor that are now willing to buy because their willingness to buy labor is being met by these folks that are lowering their price, and eventually would get you to the equilibrium. But a minimum wage above the equilibrium would stop that process, right? It would say, well, no, we can't have the wage go down, and so these people over here wouldn't be able to lower their wage that they're willing to accept. But there are black markets for labor where people will work for nothing. Like you see, like migrant workers that come from Mexico and other places that work fields in the U.S. Like sometimes you will have a lot of these folks working, below minimum wage, sort of breaking the law with respect to wage laws. All right, so the market equilibrium wage for most American workers is above the national price floor. As I said, it is going to be above the equilibrium. So it's not, you won't really get that structural unemployment that would result if the minimum wage was set above the equilibrium. Some researchers have produced evidence showing that increases in the minimum wage actually lead to higher employment when, as was the case in the United States at one time, the minimum wage is low compared to average wages. So if that wage, again, that floor is below the equilibrium, then it would just make sense that that increasing it would cause there to be more employment, because in those markets, maybe even though firms understand that they could be hiring more, they don't want to hire more because they know they have to pay more. So then they just kind of accept the minimum wage and accept what they have. And therefore, like you would have a situation if you raise the minimum wage where then they would hire more people because they can. And so the minimum wage debate is a complicated one, and you should never accept it as like a black and white issue, because it isn't. You have to consider all sorts of different labor markets. You have to consider a lot of issues, and it's something that you need to have an informed opinion about if you're going to have an opinion about it. You can't simply just take a stance on it. But if you understand like a lot of sort of the movements that occur in the economy, it is very clear that the minimum wage maybe could stand to be raised, just given the conditions of sort of like the overall wealth that's being sort of unevenly being distributed throughout the population of the U.S. and across the world. But again, in this situation, higher minimum wage could help, and sometimes it could hurt. It depends. All right. So another thing that could cause this kind of structural unemployment is labor unions. So again, labor unions are organizations that tend to have some ability to provide leverage to workers against their employers that maybe are keeping their wages too low. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. Labor unions can be corrupt, but the intention behind labor unions is obviously a good thing, but sometimes that can be problematic. Sometimes they can be their best worst enemy. So it's just, again, labor union is another complicated issue, but they can fight for higher wages that might get a wage above an equilibrium for a market, which might cause structural unemployment. So collective bargaining is what labor unions facilitate. It's intended to tip the scales of bargaining power more toward workers and away from employers. Labor unions exercise bargaining power by threatening firms with a labor strike or collective refusal to work. Something we witnessed here last year almost got to that point of having a labor strike amongst the faculty. But fortunately, we were able to avoid that, and now we're getting paid more. Yay! It's not that much more, but hey, I'll take it. In the United States, due to a low level of unionization, the amount of unemployment generated by union demands is likely to be very small. So there was just a big movement in this country against labor unions, and it's been effective. There aren't many labor unions here, but if you go like overseas to Europe, you'll see a lot of labor unions, and they're very powerful. Sometimes it's a bad thing, sometimes it's a good thing. Issues are not black and white. They're very gray, especially with respect to these issues. Another thing that could cause that kind of structural unemployment is what's called the efficiency wage. So actions by firms can contribute to structural unemployment. The efficiency wage are wages that employers set above the equilibrium wage rate as an incentive for better employee performance. So the employers themselves will set their own really high wages because they want to attract some like really quality folks. But effectively, they are cutting people out of the labor market as a result of that. Dude, I was exactly about to mention that same example. Nice. Very nice. Yeah, so Ford actually was one of the first folks, like post the Industrial Revolution, when like you had these huge companies like kind of blowing up and becoming like, you know, the dominating forces in industry. Ford was one of the first folks to say, you know what, like if we pay our people more, they're going to work more and they're going to be happier, and that's going to be better for us overall. And so he set a wage like really high, and that sent like huge waves across like in the auto industry especially, but really industries in general, because it kind of frightened folks because of the structural unemployment, you know, potential effects. But in the end, like if you want people to be happy at their jobs and therefore work, you know, excessively well, then you should be paying them higher than like the bare minimum. And, you know, Ford was a good example of that. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, so employers, again, may feel the need for such incentives for several reasons, including making better the difficulty of observing directly how hard an employee works. So if you're paying them more than the market would ask them to be paid, then obviously they're going to have more of an incentive to work and therefore less an incentive to slack off. Another thing that could cause structural unemployment is side effects of government policy. So government policies designed to help workers who lose their jobs can lead to structural unemployment as an unintended side effect. Benefits to laid off workers, unemployment, reduce a worker's incentive to quickly find a new job. So that's one potential problem that you could have with unemployment. Of course, unemployment is necessary, and post 2008, like there was this period where they like extended unemployment benefits for almost like 2 years, which is like unheard of. Generally, it's about 6 months or so, maybe less. But you know, it did potentially create an incentive for people not to look for work because they had this guaranteed amount of money for like 2 years or something. But obviously, that wasn't what was going on. What was going on was that the economy was experiencing, you know, a recession, a great recession, as it were, and that was causing just a shortage of jobs. So folks were out of work. Another possible thing that could cause structural unemployment are mismatches between employers and employees. So it takes time for workers and firms to adjust to shifts in the economy. In the aftermath of the housing bust of 2009, there were more construction workers looking for jobs than there were available. All right, so this gets us now to the natural unemployment rate. So I talked about frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So together, those are going to make up the natural rate of unemployment. So because some frictional unemployment is inevitable, and because many economies also suffer from structural unemployment, a certain amount of unemployment is normal or natural, as it were. So the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that arises from the effects of frictional plus structural unemployment. And that is different from what's called cyclical unemployment, right? So the business cycle, cyclical, That's where that term is coming from. So the cyclical unemployment is the deviation of the actual rate of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment due to downturns in the business cycle. So here's the estimated natural unemployment rate in 2013 for most countries. This is the OECD countries. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development is basically all the big developed countries. There's a lot of organizations that all the big powers of the world are part of, and the OECD is basically the one that deals with like economic stuff. We see that Norway has a really low natural rate of unemployment in 2013, 3.3. The highest was Spain at that time, 16.5. Spain has been going through a lot of turbulent times post 2008. Some other European countries as well that are part of the European Union, that are part of the Euro area, the Eurozone. We'll talk about issues related to that when we get to the last part of the course that deals with like money and banking and all the crazy important issues that are really going to explain a lot about how the world works. But yeah, Spain was kind of caught up in like a lot of what was going on, and because it's part of the union, as well as like Greece over here, then they wound up in periods where things were just really turbulent. But part of the reason why is because they have natural rates of unemployment that are really high, and that has to do with high minimum wages that they have in their countries that cause a lot of like structural unemployment. So in a lot of European countries, you'll see that there's just a lot of really high minimum wage across the continent, and that causes a lot of unemployment amongst like young people because it's really hard to find jobs because obviously the older people are the ones that have the jobs and they're not going to get rid of them. They're not going to let go of them because they pay them well. And so you'll often hear about like a lot of social strife that occurs throughout Europe, where you'll see like riots happening in like France and like Italy, and like you'll think, wait, they're a developed country. What's going on? They're acting like a developing country, but that's usually like the youth of those countries, like, and they have a strong tradition of like hitting the streets whenever like they're upset about things, and so you'll often get like even like bordering on like riot type behavior. Generally kind of in relation to like the labor conditions that exist in these countries. All right, so the relationships between the various types of unemployment are summarized as follows. So you have the natural rate of unemployment, which again is equal to frictional unemployment plus structural unemployment. And then you have actual unemployment, which is what we were talking about earlier, which is like that number that we look at, which is the amount of people looking for work, the unemployed, as a fraction of the labor force. And that is equal to the natural unemployment plus the cyclical unemployment. So perhaps because of its name, people often imagine that the natural rate of unemployment is a constant that doesn't change over time and can't be affected by government policies, but that is not the case. The natural rate of unemployment changes over time, and it can be affected by government policies. So changes in the natural rate of unemployment can be due to maybe changes in labor force characteristics. So if the pool of those working is changing for whatever reason, that can change your natural rate of unemployment. So in 2007, the rate of unemployment in the United States was 4.6%. Young workers had much higher unemployment rates during that time. So you had 15.7% unemployment rate for teenagers and 8.2% for workers aged 20 to 24. So workers aged 25 to 54 had an unemployment rate of only 3.7%. So the general age that a person is, the general age group that a person is in will make them either more or less likely to be unemployed. And so if your entire pool of workers is then changing with respect to like the average age of the group, then that's going to change the natural rate of unemployment. So generally, unemployment rates are lower for experienced than for inexperienced workers, which is the reason for this diversion between the two age groups as far as their unemployment goes. So also because older workers are more likely than younger workers to be family breadwinners, they have a stronger incentive to find and keep jobs. So one reason the natural rate of unemployment rose during the 1970s was a large rise in the number of new workers and a rising percentage of married women entering the labor force. So here we have the changing makeup of the U.S. labor force, 1948 through 2014, where you see the years on the x-axis and the percent of the labor force. Here we see that women, obviously, through the women's lib movement, finally, getting your due as far as relative equality in our society, which is still a struggle and should continue to be fought. But definitely there have been large strides in this movement that allowed women to then finally be liberated from their homes, which were essentially their prisons forever. Like, it was tradition for women not to work, obviously. We all understand this. People assume that women should not work, in fact. But things fortunately changed. In post-1970, you had a lot more women entering the labor force. And then as far as folks under the age of 25, things have changed as well throughout the last 50 or 60 years. So by the end of the 1990s, the share of women in the labor force had leveled off, and the percentage of workers under 25 had fallen sharply. So if you have less people as a percent of the labor force being under the age of 25, then that is going to directly affect your natural rate of unemployment, as well as the fact that there's more women in the labor force, which means that there's more people in general, but also you're going to get more older people that are going to be in there that are going to shift the natural rate as well. Consequently, the labor force as a whole is more experienced today than it was in the 1970s. One likely reason that the natural rate of unemployment is lower today than in the 1970s. So that's one reason the natural rate of unemployment can change, is changing characteristics of the labor force. Another one is changes in labor market institution. So unions that negotiate wages above the equilibrium level can be a source of structural unemployment, as we know. Some economists believe that the high natural rate of unemployment in Europe is caused in part by strong labor unions. In the United States, a sharp fall in union membership after 1980 may have been one reason the natural rate of unemployment fell between the 1970s and the 1990s. So we had sort of this decline of unions in this country after there was a strong movement to get rid of them, essentially, and it was effective. It got rid of a lot of them. And so then that eliminated sort of some of the structural unemployment that was maybe caused by labor unions, and therefore dropped the natural rate of unemployment. Some labor economists believe that temporary employment agencies have reduced frictional employment by helping match workers to jobs. So new government agencies that are meant to help workers find jobs, retrain them when they lose a job and they aren't very skilled at other industries, helping them to sort of become skilled and be able to adapt to changing labor market conditions. Technological change coupled with labor market institutions can also affect the natural rate of unemployment. Technological change tends to increase the demand for skilled workers who are familiar with the relevant technology and reduce the demand for unskilled workers. So this whole period that we had, the 90s up until now, when we had the digital revolution that changed the nature of basically our entire existence, but certainly the way that we produced, that made a lot of folks obsolete that maybe had dedicated themselves to just one thing their entire lives, and then that one thing became obsolete, and then they kind of became obsolete. And that is another, just a really quick aside, reason why it's really valuable for you to be here in college, because this whole experience of do this, do that, take exams and different things that are not related, and just you're feeling this feeling like you're being pulled in various directions is a good thing, because that will make you stronger with respect to being able to adapt to situations you're not used to. And what a college degree is a very clear signal that you are that type of person versus somebody who didn't go to college. And yeah, they worked their job for 30 years, but they can't adapt to other places. You have demonstrated you can go from sociology to archaeology to economics to biology to whatever. You can do these things. You can maneuver your way through them. You can adapt. You can learn different things, and you can thrive in all of them. And so that's part of what a college degree embodies, and that's why it is worth it for you to be here. So economic theory predicts that wages should increase for skilled workers and decrease for unskilled workers as technology advances. So the more skilled you are, the better things are going to be for you in the long run. If wages for unskilled workers cannot go down, say due to like a binding minimum wage, increased structural unemployment and therefore a higher natural rate of unemployment will result during periods of faster technological change. And also, of course, there are changes in government policies that can affect the natural rate of unemployment. So a high minimum wage can cause structural unemployment. Generous unemployment benefits can increase both structural and frictional unemployment, the two components of the natural rate of unemployment. Some government policies, however, may reduce the natural rate of unemployment. So job training programs are, again, supposed to provide unemployed workers with skills that widen the range of jobs they can perform. Employment subsidies are payments either to workers or to employers that provide a financial incentive to accept job offers. So really quick multiple choice. The natural rate of unemployment is A, cyclical unemployment less frictional unemployment. B, the rate of unemployment that exists during recessions. C, equal to the sum of frictional and cyclical unemployment. Or D, equal to the sum of frictional and structural unemployment. Which one is it? Ah, yes, it is D. You've been listening. I like it. Typical type of multiple choice question you could potentially get on the exam. All right, inflation and deflation. Let's talk about inflation and deflation. Prices are changing. They're either going up or down. How is this affecting the economy? What is affecting these things? So monetary officials, monetary being those that deal with the money supply in the economy. So our central bank, these central banks in other countries deal with expanding and contracting the money supply. And we'll talk about how that's done at the end of the third part of the course. We'll talk about fiscal policy, the second part of the course, which is taxing and spending policy. So monetary officials are divided between doves and hawks. So doves obviously are like more of like, let's just sit back and not do anything. And hawks are like, let's go, let's get them. Between those who want to place a high priority on low unemployment and those who want to place a high priority on low inflation. So that is sort of like the balancing act that occurs for all government officials that are involved in trying to monitor and maybe like smooth out the business cycle. It's like, well, you know, if the economy is doing really well, then we're going to get prices going up a lot. So that's inflation. That could be a bad thing. And we try to sort of manage that. And so if we try to manage it too much, we could wind up like contracting the economy. And then if you start contracting the economy, you wind up with unemployment. And so you are constantly kind of like working this balancing act where you want to be in the middle, like a middle place where it's like comfortable. Because obviously there is some unemployment that's acceptable, the natural rate, and then there is some inflation that is acceptable. So we'll talk about inflation right now. So the level of prices doesn't necessarily matter just on its own. The most common complaint about inflation is that it makes everyone poorer, right? So if prices are going up and you've got $1 in your pocket and the price has gone up, then that dollar is worth less once the prices have gone up because they can buy less, right? But inflation does not make everyone poorer. The rise in prices that has actually taken place since the early 1960s hasn't made America poorer because it has also raised incomes by the same amount, which takes us to the concept of what's called the real wage. So we saw real GDP already. Now we're seeing real wage. So anytime we're seeing real in this class, we're talking about like a number that's been adjusted for changes in prices. So we're like taking away that effect of like prices going up and down, and we're just looking at like the actual thing we're looking at. So again, with GDP, we took away the effect of the differing price level on the value of the output in the economy, and we do the same thing on the wage in order to then be able to identify, well, what's actually happening to the wage independent of the ups and downs of the overall price level in the economy. And so this concept of the real wage is the wage rate divided by the price level, and it tells us again like what's actually happening to the wage independent of the price level. And then real income is income divided by the price level as well. So if you divide something by the price level, it then gives you, it adjusts for the price level and then gives you a better idea of what's actually happening with that measure. So the level of prices doesn't matter because we can look at these real numbers, but the rate of change of prices matters. So it's crucial to distinguish between the level of prices and the inflation rate, the percent increase in the overall level of prices per year. So the inflation rate is, again, the price index in some second year minus the price index in some first year as a fraction of the price index in the first year times 100, and that tells you how much the prices have changed over that period. It's the inflation rate. So here is the inflation rate here throughout, not from 1960 to 2014. And then we also have the price level that's also plotted on this curve, on this graph. And we see that the price level is going up here consistently over this time period. But the inflation rate is like having a lot of like maybe severe ups and down over here and then kind of like leveling out over here. And that is really what is affecting like the economy at any given time. It's like how much are these prices changing right now? So the inflation rate in the 2000s was much lower than in the 1970s. So in the 2000s, it was roughly here, whereas in 1970, we can see the inflation rate was pretty high. And that made the economy richer than it would have been if high inflation had continued. So remember, the real wage is the wage divided by the inflation rate. If the inflation rate is smaller, then the real wage is going to be bigger. And the real wage represents the real purchasing power of your wage, like what you can actually trade that for in goods. So if the real wage is increasing, you could buy more stuff. Again, the same thing for real income. So economists believe that the high rates of inflation impose significant economic costs. The most important of these costs are what's called shoe leather costs, menu costs, and unit of account costs. So we'll consider each of them in turn. So shoe leather costs first. So a high inflation rate discourages people from holding money. Obviously, if you're holding money and the inflation is changing a lot, then your money's value is changing a lot. The real value of your money is changing a lot. What it can actually be exchanged for in terms of goods is changing a lot. And so, therefore, you don't want to hold a lot of money when there's a lot of high inflation. So this leads people to search for ways to reduce the amount of money they hold, often at considerable economic cost. So shoe leather costs are the increased cost of transactions caused by inflation. So because there is inflation and because it's changing the amount of the real value of what you can buy, then that's causing Gesundheit. Then that's going to cause a lot of activities going to try to like adapt to these changes quickly. And before digital anything, like people just had to physically actually run around doing things like changing prices and stuff. And so that caused the bottom of your shoe to dissipate, which is the shoe leather cost, essentially. So shoe leather costs are substantial in economies with very high inflation. During the most famous of all inflations, the German hyperinflation of 1921 through 1923. This is post-World War I, when Germany was defeated, and then their economy was basically poop after that, and that is what caused like all sorts of strife in their country, including hyperinflation, which made the value of their income be almost zero. The value of their currency be almost zero. So you could just have stacks and stacks of their currency, which was valued at nothing, essentially, not even worth the paper that it was printed on. That is what led to the rise of Hitler and World War II, essentially, like this like terrible economic strife within the country, which is then what caused us post World War II to like directly engage in the economy of Germany to make sure that that did not happen again. And so we were in control of the German economy post World War II, and we obviously divided it up between like the Western and the Eastern powers. Yes. No, they were not. No, euros weren't introduced until the 90s. Yeah, so they had their own currency. I think it was called the German mark, I think. Israel had a bunch of inflation recently. So the shoe leather cost of inflation in Israel, when the inflation rate hit 500% in 1985, people spent a lot of time in line at banks, like trying to turn in their currency or basically like trying to get their money and put it somewhere else that's going to be safe from inflation. So like if you put your money in maybe something like gold that might have like a value that is independent of what's happening within your own country, then the inflation in your country won't affect that. All right, so there's a shoe leather cost. There's also menu costs. So menu costs are the real cost of changing listed prices. So this is something that maybe was a little bit worse, obviously, pre the digital era, when people actually had to change prices on shelves. And if prices are continuously changing because you have hyperinflation, because the value of the dollar of your currency is being driven down to zero, meaning that the real value of goods is going up in terms of that currency, then you have to keep adjusting the prices that you have on the shelves to reflect the actual value, the exchange value of what you have on the shelves to this like now devalued currency. So in times of very high inflation, menu costs can be substantial. During the Brazilian inflation of the early 1990s, supermarket workers reportedly spent half of their time replacing old price stickers with new ones. With the growing popularity of online shopping, menu costs are becoming less and less important since prices can be changed electronically and fewer merchants attach price stickers to merchandise. And then finally, there's unit of account costs. So any kind of currency has three different functions. It's a unit of account. It allows us to basically just account for value. It's a store of value, so you can store the value of your wealth within it. And then it's a means of exchange. It allows you to exchange without having to like actually barter, real goods. So in hyperinflation tends, and these are things, by the way, that we will cover in fine detail in the last part of the course. And right now we're about to take a break, by the way. But let me just finish this section. Unit of account costs. So in the Middle Ages, contracts were often specified in kind. Then a tenant might, for example, be obliged to provide his landlord with a certain number of cattle each year. So we state contracts in monetary terms. Our renter owes a certain number of dollars per month. So we also tend to make our economic calculations in dollars. The role of the dollar as a basis for contracts and calculation is called the unit of account role of money. It's a role that can be degraded by inflation. The economy as a whole makes less efficient use of its resources because of the uncertainty caused by changes in the unit of account. So again, these are unit of account costs that arise from the way inflation makes money a less reliable unit of measurement. Really quick multiple choice, deflation effect on income. If deflation occurs and your income is fixed, your real income will fall, will go up, will still be equal to your nominal income, is constant. I heard A. So what is the real income again? It's your income divided by inflation, right? The price level, right? So yeah, it will go up because so you're talking so we have deflation, so prices are going down. So that number that you're dividing your income by, that's not changing. The income is not changing. That number that you're dividing it by is getting smaller. So your real income, the value of what you can actually trade for your wage, is going up, right? So nominal income is income in dollar terms. Real income is income divided by the price level. So if you have some base year price level, so this year's prices went down by 10% relative to the base year, let's say. So this year's price level is then going to equal 0.9 in relation to the base year. So if you multiply that by 100, that's going to get you to 90. So real income is nominal income divided by the price level. Nominal income, if it's equal to 100, then you're going to have, in the base year's real income, you're going to have 100 divided by the price level, which is 1. So you'll have $100, which will be your real income. And this year's real income, because now the price level is 0.9, what it was the base year, if you divide 100 by 0.9, the real value of your income is now $111.11. And that's how you get the real income. All right, let's take a break and let's come back at 35. Let's come back at 35.